This video is sponsored by Squarespace.
This bottle holds so much more than contrast paints. In fact, it holds liquid color. And using this only as contrast paint greatly limits the magic in this bottle. Let's talk about 3 ways to get the most out of your contrast paints. Before we continue, let me know in the comments, what's the most interesting way you've used or seen someone use contrast paints? Applying a vibrant base coat can be a nightmare, but you can use contrast paints to achieve beautiful results with interesting and intense shadows instantly using an airbrush. Prime your model in an interesting shadow color. Think dark purple, dark red, dark green, or blue. Then apply your white ink for your zenithal as usual. To help your interesting shadow color really stand out, I recommend spraying your white ink directly from above without wrapping around the sides. Applying too much white will erase that interesting shadow color. Let's talk color. Contrast paints can be intense, so test them off to the side to test for opacity. Since our shadows are so important, we still want our shadows to show through. Thin your contrast paint if need be, then slowly build up your colors through multiple layers with your airbrush, aiming mostly at the white. We don't want to muddy our shadow too much. If you lose your shadow color, you can always go back in with your original shadow color and reapply it, spraying through the airbrush from below. Whether you're continuing with contrast paints or using opaque paint, this has given you a great base to start your miniature project. Glazing is a great way to slowly build up color, but thinning normal paints can be difficult due to pigment breakdown. That's why contrast or speed paints are great for adding in shadows. Contrast and speed paints don't have pigments and basically are liquid color, so you never have to worry about the paint breaking down. If you've ever tried to glaze with contrast or speed paints before, you would know about the dreaded coffee staining, or the dark outline that tends to form around the edges of our applied contrast or speed paint. There are 2 ways to fix this, though they can also work hand in hand. First is a retarder, or an agent that slows down the drying time, giving us the time we need to blend away those harsh edges. Previously, I used Noosh, but here I'm using the golden acrylic medium, which is far easier to get. Mix your paint with your golden acrylic medium to your desired intensity. You definitely can go in with intense paint, but you need to be more confident in your feathering. The more translucent the layer, the less you have to worry about coffee staining and feathering. Apply your shadow color, then quickly clean your brush, wipe away excess water on a paper towel, and then slowly, using the side of your brush, erase the line of your glaze application. I imagine my brush as spreading peanut butter onto a piece of bread for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So side to side while slowly pulling it across your surface. Let's take a break from painting and talk about Squarespace, the all-in-one website and hosting platform that makes creating an online presence easier than ever. Start with one of their expertly designed templates, then customize to build your perfect website using their drag and drop system. It's so easy you'll have the time your fur babies require, which, if you're like me, is a lot. Whether you want to create a print-on-demand store, book appointments, or show off your work, Squarespace has everything you need. Check out squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, check out squarespace.com/LylaMev for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. All right, back to painting. This glaze medium can take up to 5 minutes to dry, so be sure to give it enough time before applying a second coat. Otherwise, you can pull up previous layers and it's a pain in the butt. The second way that I highly recommend using with feathering is to simply use brush direction. Your brush leaves extra paint wherever you pick it up from your model. So simply drag your shadow colors deeper into your shadows. If you use thin enough paint, you won't need to feather at all. But if you want to do fewer, more opaque layers, feathering will be required no matter what. Building up highlights with contrast paints is doable, but different. Contrast paints are subtractive colors, meaning that every coat of paint you apply darkens down the previous coat. You can't apply a yellow contrast paint over a red contrast paint to lighten it. It will always be darker. Here, I want to add orange highlights. So I'm mixing up a red and yellow contrast paint with white ink for opacity, which wasn't opaque enough for me. The white ink really just turned it into a pastel here and didn't add the opacity I was hoping it would. So I'm adding in a bit of orange paint in a corresponding color. The glaze medium will help suspend the pigment in our normal paint more evenly, and our contrast paints should help hide any pigment breakdown that might accidentally occur. Here, the paint is so thin I don't need to feather at all. I'm highlighting the top of the ribs, the top of the thigh, pauldron, head, and fabric, any area that is perpendicular to my light source. As with all glazing, I'm building up these highlights slowly. Again, you could go for a more opaque layer, but it will be more difficult to feather out. Remember to start larger with your first layer and then shrink the layers as you go, concentrating our color and opacity at the center of each application. The more layers you add, the more opaque that color will become. Here I am going particularly slowly, using more coats of more translucent paint than I normally would. I definitely could have completed the same model using 1 or 2 applications of more opaque paint, but I wanted to demonstrate the slower transition one can create using only brush direction. For a final pop, I'm doing some edge highlighting, again with a rather thinned down paint. Using a pure opaque paint would cause too harsh of a contrast, so using a bit of glaze medium will help blend the edge highlighting into the rest of the model. For a final trick, you can use contrast paint to shift or intensify your hue beyond highlights and shadows. One of my favorite ways to add a little life to my model is to add in red to the joints or cheeks. Again, thin down your paint using your medium, and then apply it to your model, pulling towards the center of your desired area. Again, this helps blend the paint naturally. If you're nervous, remember, go slowly and build up multiple layers. Second, you can bring back lost vibrancy or intensity simply by glazing speed paints over previously applied opaque paints. Again, they're just liquid color, so if you have a yellow that's looking a bit pastel, glaze in with a yellow speed paint. If your red has ended up a little pink, go in with a red speed paint. You can use speed paints or contrast paints similarly to how you might use inks. Just be careful, as speed paints and contrast paints tend to be more intense than inks. Lastly is a matte varnish. Contrast paints are very glossy, which can distract from our painted highlights. Painting a matte varnish assures that the highlights will appear exactly where we want them. If you feel like you're having problems with contrast paints or washes, check out this video here where I go over everything you need to know to have a perfect wash or contrast paint application. If you like what I do, you know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe, go join me on Patreon. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.